Assalamu alaikum. With me, myself, I'm Hassan Abao here, and Fuad Mughal. Previously, we did a podcast, which was a much longer podcast. It was probably more of a brainstorming podcast in us getting our ideas together on some very complex discussion points around life and how life came about and what does that mean from an Islamic perspective. Hopefully in this podcast, we'll try and be much more shorter and succinct and to the point, because we've kind of structured it into a shorter set of slides that we can talk about and discuss around. Okay. So in that sense, I will try and kind of run the podcast, but then for chime in, bring in some key points over here that I may have missed out or haven't thought through. The podcast agenda is pretty simple. What we're going to go through is what is the objectives of this podcast? Why are we doing it? We'll do an introduction to the scope of our analysis. We'll then introduce 5 areas of analysis. And for each of the area of analysis that we will present, what is the key description and key points based on current scientific thinking? And against that current scientific thinking, what is the Islamic position? Again, that Islamic position is based on our understanding. Then we'll summarize that. And then we'll then step back and say, so what? What is this telling us? What does that really mean? And then out of this work that we've done, there are even further areas to explore because we are really just scratching the surface.
And that's a key. That's a key point there, Has. There's a lot of knowledge around on this, or a lot of research that's been done around all of these things, and we've only really scratched the surface of all of that sort of stuff. So it really is for people to then go off and do their own more deep dive research to get a real understanding of this. We're just posing the questions and coming up with answers that help us, rather than necessarily saying this is the final word on anything, really.
Exactly. The other thing I wanted to point out is we've read various articles just to get some grounding, Wikipedia articles, Nature articles, and so on. We've also gone into a book called Islam and Evolution by Dr. Shoaib Malik as well, and there's some really good analysis work that he's done from an Islamic lens. He's taken out, he's used the Asharite school as his lens to look at evolution and then come up with what does that mean from an Islamic perspective. And some of our thinking leverages some of his work as well, which we will then talk about in this podcast. Okay, so in terms of objectives, there are essentially 3 things that we want to get out of this, and I think Fuad mentioned that earlier. One is getting a better understanding and grounding to what is the latest thinking of life on Earth, right? I think all of us, we've been discussing this topic for a long time, but we've been discussing it in pockets, and in some sense, what we've done this time is trying to sort of arrange it and bring it together in some way and look at it from an Islamic lens, which is number 2. What does Islam have to say about life and how life developed? And that's part of the discussion. And then the key thing is, by having this discussion, as Fuad said, we've just scratched the surface. We can help ourselves and our kids hopefully better understand some of these burning questions in life that we have. And hopefully they'll have these same questions at some point, or some of them are asking the same questions now. A further point I'd like to also make in here is, look, we're not experts in science or Islam, right? But this is our attempt to make sense of things, so it gives us grounding and gives us some meaning. Okay. Fuad, anything else you want to add?
Yeah, it's just that there is as Muslims, there's an obligation for us to have understanding. And a lot of the things that we do in our day-to-day lives, we always seek the underlying reasons as to why it's happening. So why should that not apply to some of the bigger questions that are out there? It's not enough to simply say that's how it is. I think as Muslims, you should explore and understand and have a better understanding of our world and the things around us, because it allows us to have a better relationship with our Creator as a consequence, I believe.
Yeah. In terms of the structure, the way we've looked at things, again, what we've done is we've taken the current thinking of how the universe evolved and how the Earth was created, the solar system was created, and then life was created. And what this is called in general parlance is it's essentially called big history, right? You can look at it on Wikipedia and deep dive into all the facets of it. But essentially what it looks like is essentially from the earliest universe, what people may call the Big Bang, until today, we're looking at a time frame of 13 billion years, right? Now, what we are not looking in this podcast is the origins of the universe, i.e. the Big Bang and how that came about and so on. We are making an assumption that that occurred or that's how life started, but we are not looking at that. What we are essentially looking at is 5 areas of analysis. That is the sort of 4.5 billion years from when the solar system and the Earth essentially came about based on current thinking to today. That's essentially what we are diving into. Now, we've broken this up into essentially 5 areas. One is the anthropic principle, which we'll go through, abiogenesis, the tree of life, and how do we get to complexity that is through the tree of life to today? So the mechanism of the tree of life, how did that come about? We sort of go into that. And then we've separated out humanity and especially Adam in this, or humans, which is number 5. What we'll do is we'll give a description and some key points to get some grounding of each of these 5 areas. And then based on our understanding, what is the Islamic position of each of those areas? Okay. Okay, so let's start with the first one. The first one is the anthropic principle. Now, the key concept over here is that the structure of the universe, the values of constants of nature, like gravitational constants, the charge of an electron, Planck's constants, the speed of light, and the laws of nature has bearing upon the existence of life, right? But if you look into that, it's a very narrow window for that to have occurred, right? There's a lot of unpredictability and unstable universe around that if those conditions were not met, the life as we see it today would not have occurred, okay? Now, in some sense, you could argue that, look, this is a more finer, refined version of what Descartes would have said, look, I exist in this universe, and therefore the universe exists in a fashion that's consistent with my existence within it, right? That's why we can see it. That's why we're
that's a
here.
good point. But that's a good point there in terms of what Descartes saying. It's a bit chicken and egg in the sense that the reason why I can recognize the universe is because I'm in it.
Right.
If I wasn't in it, I wouldn't recognize it. So does that then mean there are other universes, dimensions, etc., that we don't recognize because we're not in them?
Possibly. And I think if we look at the Quranic interpretation of that, and I'll give a few verses on there. If we look at Surah Fatiha, verse 1:1, all praise is due to Allah, Lord of the worlds, right? Now, we can take different interpretations of what worlds could be, right? They could be physical worlds, as you mentioned, Fuad, or even at different planes of existence, such as what we can see versus what we can't see as well,
yeah,
right?
Indeed.
That is part of our belief, right? That there can be different planes of existence. And as you know, I mean, you go into quantum physics and that realm of science, and there's all kinds of chatter of metaverses and parallel universes and so on and so forth, right? Still to be explored, still to be
Well,
understood.
there's a whole theory in itself on parallel universes, right?
Mhm.
So that was postulated in what, the late 50s, 60s, the
That's
idea
right.
of parallel universes existing, and therefore that, and if that was the case, there has to be infinite number of parallel universes, because why would you stop? Why would there be a limit to parallel universes? So in that regard, there would theoretically be a version of this podcast talking about something else happening at the same time, or infinite numbers of versions of this podcast happening in various different guises.
Possibly, unless you've been watching a lot of Spider-Man.
Well, there is that as well.
Okay, so let's move on to the next one. So that's the anthropic principle. The next one is
Before we move on
Sure.
to that, so effectively what we're saying is that the idea of the universe existing is quite narrow. The parameters that allow the universe to exist are quite narrow.
Yeah.
And so therefore the chances of them happening by chance are very limited.
That's right. Okay. So the next one is abiogenesis. And the key concept over here, the description over here, is the origin of life, which is abiogenesis, is still a great mystery to science. That is, how can you go from very simple molecules, hydrogen, carbon, and so on and so forth, that are the base building blocks of life? How can you go from there to something that is more complex, that has DNA and RNA, and hence enables life to exist the way we know it today? And that is something that is still a mystery to science, right? We don't know how that sort of, people call it the primordial soup, for example, right? We don't know how that has occurred, right? And from a timeline perspective, that is in a 500 million year window between 4.5 billion years and 4 billion years is when the idea is that occurred, but we don't know how.
But it's also counter to other observable phenomena, right? That what we observe in other scenarios is things going from a position of order to a position of chaos or disorder,
right?
Not from a position of simple to complex. You go from complex to simple, not the other way around.
Exactly, and that's an interesting dimension to this as well. Yeah. From an Islamic perspective, like it in our, what we sort of discussed was, while this is an unknown, we do not have an Islamic position, because look, even if it is known that we can go from molecules to complex DNA, RNA based life form, Islam, from our understanding, doesn't have anything to say about it.
No, but I mean, you could infer that life was created by Allah, right?
Right.
Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created life. Now, how he did that, we don't know.
Exactly.
And this is the thing that, whilst it might be silent on the specifics, there's an overarching position, which is everything was created.
Yeah.
All things were created by Allah, by the Creator.
Exactly. Okay. So let's move from that period of abiogenesis to when, in the previous period, let's assume we had simple bacteria, and then where do we go from there, right? And that is essentially in what people call the tree of life.
But it's an extrapolation. Sorry, Has, but it's an extrapolation of the previous slide. The previous slide said we go from simple things to complex things.
Yeah.
And what effectively this is saying is that complexity continues.
That's right. That's correct.
We continue with complexity, and it's extrapolating that same principle and saying, whilst you went from single or molecules to more complex structures, those complex structures became even more complex over time.
Exactly, and that is the period from 4 billion years to today, from a timeline perspective. Now, the concept of a tree of life or universal tree of life, it's a metaphor, it's a model, and a research tool used to explore evolution of life and describe the relationship between organisms, both living and extinct, right? And this sort of is linked back to a famous passage in Charles Darwin's Origin of Species. But I think one of the things, if you remember what we were talking about in the previous podcast, is that if you even look at some of the Islamic scientists, such as Ibn Khaldun and even others before him, they observed this phenomenon, right? Because that's what they were doing. They were looking at how do animals live? How do birds live? How do how do plants and animals interact? And how do you go from simple organisms to more complex organisms? So I think one of the key things that we should mention is that this idea of the tree of life is not necessarily a Darwinian notion, right? I think what Darwin did was he connected the dots with a few things and then it became general knowledge. But he built this knowledge on the shoulders of others who came before him, including Muslim scientists as well.
Yeah, they made an inference. Absolutely, they made an inference. There was a connectedness between different organisms, plants, animals, etc. They made an inference that the rocks and the ground, the plants, the animals all had some level of connectedness through time, which wasn't necessarily therefore a new concept when Darwin came along. However, Darwin did use his observation of minor differences between animals of the same species to try and extrapolate that further. I suppose that's
Exactly.
where it sort of became more well known from that point onwards.
Yeah, and in the appendix of this slide deck, we've put some references to Ibn Khaldun and some of his words from the Muqaddimah that you can have a look at to see what they've said and see it's not very far from that. From an Islamic perspective, I guess Quran 21:30 says, do the disbelievers not realize that the heavens and earth were one mass, then we split them apart, and we created from water every living thing, would they not then believe? So that's from the Quran. I think from our perspective, again going back, Islam does not have anything to say about the origin and complexity of the tree of life. In fact, we are in awe of it, right? That would be the way I look at this. That look at this. Look, isn't this telling us that there's a creator behind this, right? That this sort of complexity, and we've not found it anywhere in the universe that we know of, there's a creator behind this, and that's our belief.
It's there's a famous there's famous passages from the Quran, isn't it? Surah I've forgotten the surah now. Yeah, the line basically, the ayah is basically which of the signs of Allah do you deny? I'm horribly paraphrasing, but effectively that's the position that we take as Muslims when we see something and understand its complexity and understand that this then led to this and led to this, doesn't make us potentially question our faith. It makes us feel more, as you say, in awe of the creation around us, and further validates our belief in there being a creator.
Exactly. And I think, again, look, whatever tree of life I may put over here, it will never represent what reality is, because reality is much more complex than what we assume it is, right? We always put abstract models in front of us and then say, okay, that's what reality looks like. And what is interesting in the next slide or discussion is the concept of evolution and the complexity that occurs. So in the previous discussion, we were talking about the concept of the tree of life. what we want to talk about here is the mechanism by which the tree of life how does it occur, right? Now, of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in our belief, is the prime mover of everything. That's essentially where we're coming from. But let's discuss what does science tell us as the mechanism, right? Some key points over here. One is there's multifactorial evidence for evolution, including fossils, homology, genetics, geology. All these different sciences have come together to then corroborate that has this happened? Does this happen this way? It's not a case of just looking at this from one lens or from one science perspective, but you need to bring multiple sciences together. So that's one thing. The other thing is the theory of evolution is evolving as we are learning more, right? So even though we talk about Darwin, and what Darwin came about was the concept of variation or natural selection and some level of inheritance, it was a very small bubble of understanding the idea of natural selection and survival of the fittest and so on and so forth. But then that notion was extended further with neo-Darwinism, which is modern synthesis, right? When we had Mendelian inheritance, the understanding that actually you are passing information from parent to children. And in that movement of information, there are changes that occur, right? That's why, for example, eye colors are different, or certain features are different, or the children may look like their grandparents, but not the parents, and so on and so forth, right? Because then you're getting into gene mutation and inheritance and population genetics and so on and so forth, right? But then as that science has evolved and we've learned more about the cell, the DNA, RNA, and um, how creation occurs, we find extended synthesis occurs, that it's much, much more complicated, right? And this area is expanding, right? So essentially what we're basically saying is evolution occurs through more complex interleaving factors than just survival of the fittest or natural selection that we are taught to believe when we are supposed to look at Dawkins' simple way of looking at things. It's just survival of the fittest, and you're just left with one thing, and you're thinking, well, is it just that, or is there more to this? Right? You dig deeper, and there's more.
Yeah, you do, and the traditional position has always been a gradual change, whereas we know the reality of change is more random and haphazard. You know, there are big leaps that happen at various different points in history, according to the science. So therefore, it cannot simply be, as you state, one factor that drives the evolution and change.
And that's I think, Ford, you raise an interesting point that even, for example, that really big book I was reading on genes, it kept putting the phrase in its equations about random. And that word kept sticking in my head. Is random meaning we don't know, right? Is that
usually that's the case.
We don't know how that happens. So fine, we'll just put that as a random over there, right? Still to be understood. So I believe this Venn diagram we're seeing over here is continuously going to grow, and continuously going to evolve.
But that's scientific method generally, right? So scientific method is always, you start with a premise or a theory, and effectively that holds water in the observable space that it's in until you get new observations. And then either that's thrown out or you add to it. And effectively, to your point, you then create a wider set of parameters that then creates a new observable universe to measure that theory against, and so on and so forth. It's very, very rare that you actually throw out what was proved before, because it is still, those observations still hold true. They're just limited for the time and place that they were observed.
Exactly. So from an Islamic perspective, I think what we came down to when we were discussing is that, look, nothing in Islam that contradicts that two things. One is that the earth is old, which is what Dr. Shoaib Malik makes in his book, and nothing in Islam that would contradict how life evolves, right? Whether it's or the mechanism, whether it's Darwinian to extended synthesis, right?
Yep.
That's just an observation that scientists have made.
Indeed.
Okay. Okay, and I think the final one is we broke down the, humans and Adam, and I think what's interesting with this one over here, if you look at the timeline that I put right at the top, it's squashed in 7 million years, right? What we are talking about here is if you look at the tree of life from the previous page, it's huge, but this is a very tiny segment of that tree of life that's right at the edge at 7 million years, right? And what is interesting about here is three things. One is there's a common misconception that we developed from apes or chimpanzees, right? But in fact, if you look at this, the human root is a complete separate branch from chimpanzees and gorillas, right? So that's a misconception. The second thing is 7 million years ago, when that split occurs, and we don't know how, we lost a chromosome but gained a thumb. And after that, 100 to 150,000 years ago, we developed universal language and thought, but we don't know how those things occurred. There is no scientific knowledge today that can explain how that occurred. Right. That's
But
essentially
again,
where we are.
And the thing is, 20 years ago, that branch at the top would have only had 4 human species in. It now has 9, right?
Right.
So we're constantly finding additional elements to bolster what that looks like. You know, so new Homo species have effectively been created within you know, through finding and through research, but it doesn't account for the difference between Homo sapiens and some of those other hominids. It just, you know, it doesn't. There is nothing that links those hominids to Homo sapiens because of the difference in development between Homo sapiens and those other hominids. I don't think. There may be some similarities, but the biggest thing or the biggest difference is the fact, to your point, is universal language and thought, which didn't occur in some of those early humans.
And I think for me, that's a very telling point, because I think sometimes what we are very focused on is the physical, like bone structures or homology or and so on and so forth.
Because it's obvious and ezy to classify. Whereas
Exactly.
You cannot classify the stuff that doesn't leave a physical presence behind.
Exactly. And I think for us Muslims, that in fact is a critical element, right? That complexity of the mind, that's something for what you and I, we were talking when we were doing the AI podcast, that in fact, some people believe that the most complex thing known to man is possibly the human mind. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And that is one area we don't even know how it works. We have inferences of it, you know, and to your point, yeah, even we can tell how neurons function and how they signal each other, but we don't even know what they're telling each other.
So you've got this idea that humans are different, that humans have, to a certain extent, have an exceptionalism about them that keeps them apart from the rest of the animal world or the rest of the species on the planet.
Other humanoids, even
even
other humanoids, right? Because we
exactly.
don't. Our belief is that, or what we even understand from a science perspective, is that possibly, maybe even humans are the only ones who had universal language and thought. Who knows?
You know, we don't know.
We don't know.
That's the thing, we
so,
don't know.
From an Islamic perspective, I think this is an area that's interesting to look at. right? Because that's where there's differences of potential opinions of where people are coming from, right? So one of the 6 principles of Iman, or faith, that we have as Muslims is the belief that Adam alayhi salam was a living person. Now, that's a belief I have, Fuad, that's a belief that you have.
I think it's more Aqidah than Iman. Iman is your personal belief, but I think what you're saying here is creed. So this is Aqidah.
Yeah.
One of the points of Aqidah is belief in the prophets, including Adam and Salam, as being living humans that existed. Yeah.
Yeah. So what Dr. Shoaib Malik puts in his book in terms of where Muslims are coming from, or how they are sort of positioned as far as evolution is concerned, and especially humans and Adam are concerned, is essentially 4 buckets. One is creationism, which is nothing is a product of evolution. That's sort of one extreme at one end, right? There's another extreme at the other end, which is there's no exceptions. Everything is a product of evolution, including Adam alayhi salam and so on, because the idea that potentially Adam alayhi salam is metaphorical, and that's what some say at the other end. But some in the middle, you have 2 positions. One is human exceptionalism. Humans are not part of the evolutionary tree of life that we are discussing, or this page over here, or that humans are, but Adam is an exceptionalism in this. Now, that's where Shoaib Malik and the work he's done is he feels that is probably the right answer according to him, because from his perspective, we don't know whether Adam alayhi salam was put into earlier humans. We don't know. And that may be the infinite power that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has, where he could have done them.
Well, we don't know. And this is the
We don't
thing.
know,
So,
exactly.
So the position that Islam takes is that he was real and that he existed and that he was a prophet. Now, the nature beyond that is pure speculation, obviously.
Exactly.
So the position, all those 4 positions that you've articulated, to a certain extent, are within or have been articulated by Islamic scholars. You know, they've effectively there are instances of all of those 4 potentially appearing in texts going back in the past.
Yeah.
So what it shows is there's a pluralistic view in Islam that encompasses a lot of those things. But that shouldn't necessarily take us away from the idea that we are all part of a created realm.
Yeah, I agree. So let's move on to the final few pages. So what we've done, and this is for the slides that's in the description, is we've tried to summarize all of this on one page. So it just makes it easier that if you're looking at one page, how are all these pieces that we've described connected together? Because they are connected, right? And one of the challenges that we have seen is that, as we were discussing, that the humans and Adam and the challenges that people may have in that space, that everything else that comes before it is then thrown out, right? And we need to just be very mindful of that we don't necessarily need to do that, right? We need to be quite honest about science as well. What can we accept and what we can't? And the things we can't accept, here they are.
Yeah, I mean, you can't say the universe isn't old,
right?
You know, potentially, because it's observable. You can observe the age of the universe through looking at distant stars. So therefore, there must have been a time before, and therefore you then have to accept some of these principles that existence has happened for a lot longer than necessarily the recent history would suggest.
Exactly. Okay. So let's sort of round up in terms of so what. Okay. four things over here. One is science never comes with complete answers, right? It's always a work in progress, right? But going back to the point we were making earlier, that doesn't mean we reject what science says, right? Our We should be looking into it and saying, what does this mean, right? And if that means going deeper into it, that's part of our journey that we need to make. That's the way we think. Um, we will accept all scientific theory as working models, but not truth as it changes. And as Muslims, we accept the Quran as our source of truth. Right? The third item is empirical science shines a light on what is observable, but has no answers for many hard questions, including consciousness that we were discussing about. Look, the most complex item known to man is the human mind, and we haven't cracked the idea of consciousness. We have no answer for that. The fourth item, and this is the key one, the apparent design. Let's look at the apparent design. We are in awe of the complexity of life and everything around us and unanswered questions as they point to a creator, right? That's the way we think. That's the way we see things as Muslims.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, when we are presented with apparent contradictions, and think of an example like duck-billed platypus, for instance, which is effectively a mammal that lays eggs and has a bill. You know, the apparent contradictions in that particular animal, you know, helps. You know, from a Muslim perspective, it just shows the way that creation can be effectively inspiring in the sense that it doesn't follow the rules, yet it still exists. How can
Right.
that be? How can that be the case? So therefore, it's another example of how, you know, as someone who believes in the creator, another element of creation is evidenced, as it were.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay.
So yeah. So I think that's my main takeaway from all of this. Doesn't mean that there's no evidence for a creator as a result of this. It just means that there is more awe and inspiration in understanding that leads us to a better belief in our creator.
Exactly. Exactly. Okay. So in terms of further areas to explore right now, in this podcast, we have positioned Islam as the sort of yardstick by which we've looked at all these other things, right? But that raises the question in terms of the Quran, Iman, Aqidah, as Fuad you are mentioning. How do we accept this? That is probably something we will look at going forward, right? The second thing that we need to look at is what is belief system and science as a method of inquiry, because I think that is something that needs to be explored and brought out more, because we talk about science, we talk about all these concepts about how do we really evaluate something, and they strengths and weaknesses in methods, they strengths and weaknesses in the current empirical scientific method. And we'll try and bring some of that out. And also what it can't do, where are its gaps, where it can't put a lens on something, and what does that mean? And that's number two. And then I think there's a discussion we do need to have around some of the hard questions that science so far or may never have answers for, right? Such as consciousness, matter, motion, and even turbulence, right? We don't have answers for how these things work.
That's because science, I think, to a certain extent, has moved away from, in the past, what you had is philosophers who did science and therefore sort of married a lot of philosophical thought into the science. Whereas now science has moved much more towards, as you say, empirical evidence and looking at observable solutions or observable experimentation to then explain what's going on, rather than potentially thinking about the metaphysical or the philosophical aspects of things, which potentially in the past people who were looking at things would have looked at it in a more rounded manner.
Exactly, and Fuad, you raise an interesting point, and this is probably we'll dig a bit deeper in podcast number 3 on this, is when we were looking at even scratching the surface on artificial intelligence and consciousness and things like that. There's a lot of research now coming around that we need to just reevaluate our model of the mind, our model of computation, how we think about these things, because the models and concepts we have developed is not working for understanding consciousness, right? And there is a train of thought in that space to say, actually, we may need to go back to the old school philosophical way of looking at things and then link that back into science. And if we don't make that linkage, then we'll always remain in one plane and we'll never be able to bridge some of these hard questions.
Indeed.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you, Fuad, for taking part in this. I'd also say, look, big thank you to Jamal as well. He couldn't make it today, but look, he was a really big input into this work as well, and really opened up my mind on quite a few things.